This evening, we're meeting with Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta. Welcome, Pratap. One of India's leading thinkers. He heads one of Delhi's most dynamic think tanks. He's a great scholar. He's a great writer. The think tank is the Center for Policy Research. It's been growing. It covers virtually all aspects of India's life in its programming. In his own life, he writes prodigiously, both in scholarly mode, in policy analysis mode, and also as a media commentator. His weekly column in the Indian Express is always looked forward to by virtually everybody. But he contributes as well to the Financial Times, the New York Times, and many other papers. As a scholar, he is at the intersection of several disciplines: philosophy, politics, law as well. And increasingly, many of the great scholars in the social scientists are no longer burrowing down in one discipline, but are actually more interested in the creative overlaps between them. And I think on that, Pratap, you're a model for us all. Tonight, he is at the UN University to have a public engagement on India as a global actor. So we thought we'd share with our viewers online, in fact, a preview of some of the things we may touch on later in public. So I thought I'd start, Pratap, by asking you about the origins of Indian foreign policy, how you would trace them yourself.
I think the origins of Indian foreign policy lie in the nature of India's nationalist movement. I think what that nationalist movement bequeathed to India was, first of all, I think, a commitment to being both an Asian country but also being an Enlightenment power, imbibing liberal democracy. And I think that is a very important aspect of India's identity now, which shapes its foreign policy. I think, second, at least that generation had a profound sense of internationalism. Jawaharlal Nehru in particular, as you know, key figure in the early years of the founding of the United Nations. And even though there is a lot of criticism of Nehru in contemporary India, I think that aspiration that India should play a global role, I think still remains very, very strong. In fact, I think in India, the criticism often is that it's actually much more stronger than it should be. After all, we do have a 19th century economy still. Per capita income is what was in the US probably 1880, and yet we are aspiring to be a 21st century power. But that internationalism and openness, I think, remain quite central. And the third, I think, element which that movement bequeathed, which was, it was born out of an anti-colonial struggle. But I think remarkably, if you look at the range of anti-colonial movements, one of the few anti-colonial movements that said, we must not see ourselves only as a victim. One of the few anti-colonial movements that did not succumb to ideological extremism either of the left or of the right. And one of the few anti-colonial movements that, in a sense, professed what has come to be known as non-alignment. But by non-alignment, simply the aspiration that India should achieve a certain kind of strategic autonomy, not tie itself too easily to any of the competing ideologies. I think that basic framework was very much set in that nationalist movement.
I think were Nehru alive today, he'd probably be unsurprised, yet very happy, to find India has been essentially an uninterrupted democracy since independence, with occasional authoritarian temptations, but no authoritarian success.
Right. No, I think the one thing which he grasped fundamentally, that if India is to survive as a nation, it has to be a democracy. That's the only means of incorporating and functioning with diversity. And I think that culture has, now become internalized. I think, India has lots of things to answer for, lots of debilitating weaknesses. But I don't think anyone can doubt the robustness of its democracy.
Now, Canada, my country, is exceptionally fortunate in its
Right.
neighborhood.
Right,
Its
right.
neighbors are two great oceans, the Great North and a neighbor to the south, which on balance has been a fabulous neighbor for Canada. India lives in a much rougher neighborhood.
Right.
So I wanted to ask you the extent to which you think India has been tied down by its neighborhood, is seeking to transcend the neighborhood, or should, before transcending it, seek to reach more of an accommodation with the neighborhood?
I mean, India's neighborhood is its biggest foreign policy challenge. There's no question about it. And it's a big foreign policy challenge in two ways. One, because it impinges on its domestic politics much more closely than almost any other problem. And frankly, many would argue that actually one of the reasons India-Pakistan relations are so difficult on both sides is because they were born out of a history of partition. It's not a conventional foreign policy problem. It's a psychological problem. It's a historical problem. So to that extent, it imposes special burdens, I think, on India. In my mind, there is no doubt that if India is to play a significant role on the world stage, it will have to, as it were, not just be generous to its neighbors, but actually have to demonstrate leadership in its own neighborhood. Because what the politics of our region has done is it has pulled India back, and I'll list 2 or 3 ways in which it has. First, I think it has cut down our freedom to think conceptually and boldly. To just give an example, you have written a lot about, when the United Nations was founded in its early years, India was one of the most powerful anti-sovereigntist powers that were around. That was Nehru's conception of a genuinely human rights-based internationalism. But our own border problems, the fact that we've not been able to come to a enduring peace in the subcontinent, actually, and our experience with the United Nations over Kashmir, had this effect of actually making us much more insecure about thinking boldly in international affairs than we otherwise would have been. So that's one important sense in which it's tied it down. It has tied us down in the sense that obviously the commitment to a defense architecture, military spending, clearly does sort of take away our degrees of freedom in moving around the rest of the world. And I think it also ties it down to the extent that, if we can't manage our own neighborhood, it's going to be difficult for us to demonstrate enduring leadership at a global stage.
Nevertheless, in recent years, because of its scale, its weight, India has been rising to the high table, so to speak, the G20, various other forums that range in appeal, BRICS, the India, Brazil, South Africa grouping. Its voice is heard more loudly in the IMF. In international trade talks, it's often one of the 2 or 3 critical actors. So in spite of these regional constraints, it is a very meaningful international actor at this point. What do you think it will do with this possibility now that it simply didn't have 50 years ago?
No, I mean, I think, by and large, India's foreign policy has been oriented towards 2 goals, and I think they'll define its international engagement. The first priority has been, of course, to kind of secure its own space for its own development. Fortunately for the rest of the world, that has never meant territorial aggrandizement, and outside of its immediate neighborhood, India is actually quite a non-threatening power, which is a huge foreign policy asset. But it will work towards an architecture, and I think that has been its position, stated position, but also its practice, of an international architecture that is open, fair, and just. And I think often when India is seen as obstructing multilateralism, a case can be made that it is actually doing so on the grounds of creating a more equitable and just sort of international order. As I said, I think on certain issues like defense of human rights and democracy, perhaps India could be a bit more vocal, consistent with its own, I think, moral identity as a democratic power. But I think by and large it'll be a good force for multilateralism in the long run.
Well, one thing that's striking to me as an observer of international human rights, treaty-making discussions, normative development, is the paradox that on the one hand, India is often quite reserved internationally on these issues. On the other hand, India itself represents the most exciting struggle for human rights since 1947 across many different types of government, all of them essentially democratic, supporting different types of approaches to securing greater rights for citizens. And one of my frustrations as a foreign friend of India is that this fabulous struggle for human rights in India hasn't been translated into an international narrative. Perhaps it's again the India that doesn't want to impose itself on others.
I think there are three different factors at play. I mean, one, I think, frankly, I think is the way in which I think global histories are actually written. I mean, at one level, I think India's democratic moment is for humanity of at least as much significance as the American Revolution or the French Revolution was, a kind of poor post-colonial democracy, saying that democracy can work in an illiterate, poor society. And so I think our conceptual thinking about democracy has not yet quite embraced the Indian experience. I think, as you know, in most political science courses until very recently, in any literature on democratization, they would simply say, oh, India is an exception, and then move on.
Absolutely.
So there is, I think, a larger concept, kind of the way we write our histories in an era of globalization. But I think more concretely, I think there are two issues. One, I think you could argue that precisely because of the historical experience of that struggle for democracy, I think India is perhaps a little bit more cautious about the instruments you can use to promote democracy. I think it has much more of a sense of the fragility of power, how good intentions backfire in the promotion of democracy. So often the disagreement, I think, with active democracy promoters is not over principle. It really is over tactics, strategy, and a judgment about how much external powers can actually achieve. And often those interventions end up being counterproductive, that really democracy has to be owned by those who are going to live it if it's going to be successful. I think the second story, which, in some senses India is actually similar to the United States in this respect, which is, the United States, although it does actively promote democracy sometimes, but in terms of actually acceding to international instruments like International Criminal Court and so forth, is a very reluctant power. And it has been said, I think, not without some justifications, that countries that have a very deep sense of their own democratic legitimacy actually find it harder to subscribe to these international institutions because they somehow feel they don't need these institutions to legitimize who they are. And often, paradoxically, it's actually middling kind of countries who think they need external legitimation, who actually are much more activist in this way.
Yes. Right. Now, finally, India will have elections, national level elections, a huge undertaking with over 1 billion citizens, and an undertaking that's been carried off consistently well in India, it has to be said, over the years. On the international relations, foreign policy front, if you had 3 suggestions for the next government of any party, or more likely coalition of parties, what would they be?
I think the first suggestion would be about the neighborhood, that India really must act as if it is the big power in the neighborhood. And for me, that principally means generosity and playing for the longer game rather than getting caught up in day-to-day reciprocity issues. I think the second suggestion would be invigorating India's own state capacity. As you very well know, I think this architecture of the Indian state is actually not geared to fulfill the large mandate that is kind of placed upon it internationally. It has a very small foreign service, very few experts. So it really needs to shore that up. And I think the third suggestion would be that, India's best foreign policy is its own success. If India can get to 7-8% growth and be a democracy, all strategic options will be open. And if it doesn't do that, frankly, it won't have too many options.
Terrific, Pratap. Thank you very much for being with us in Tokyo and for sharing some minutes with our viewers online.
Thank you very much.